I was 31 years old, standing at my sister's engagement party in a catering apron, carrying a tray of empty glasses back to the kitchen while my family laughed and posed for photos 20 feet away. No one called me over. No one saved me a seat. No one introduced me to a single guest. My sister had asked me to help coordinate things the week before, and somehow that had turned into me being the one scraping plates and refilling water pitchers while she slow danced with her new fiancé under the lights. I had paid for half of that party, and not one person in that room seemed to remember it. Before I tell you what happened when the groom's father found me alone by the kitchen doorway, I want to ask you something honest. If the person you had spent years quietly supporting suddenly treated you like hired help in front of everyone, would you say something? Or would you stay quiet one more time? Think about that while you listen, because Lousia thought about it too, and her answer surprised even herself. My name is Lousia. I am 31 years old, and for most of my life I have been the kind of woman who keeps things running without asking for recognition. I am not saying that to sound noble. I am saying it because it took me a very long time to understand the difference between being generous and being used. That night at my sister Camille's engagement party was not the first time my family had made me feel invisible, but it was the first time someone outside my family noticed it out loud. Let me take you back to where this really started, because that night at the party did not happen in a vacuum. It was the result of years of small decisions that my family made and I allowed, and years of small choices I made that slowly shrunk me down into someone who expected to be overlooked. I grew up in a house with 2 parents and 1 younger sister. My father, Bernard, worked in logistics and was gone more than he was home. My mother, Renata, held the family together with a combination of love and quiet favoritism that she would never admit to out loud, but that every single person in our extended family could feel the moment they walked into a room with all 4 of us together. Camille was 5 years younger than me. She was the pretty one, the social one, the one who made my parents laugh at dinner. She had a way of filling a room with energy that I genuinely admired when I was a child. I wanted to protect that energy. I thought it was my job. When we were growing up, I was the one who did well in school quietly. Camille was the one who did okay in school loudly. I graduated in the top 5% of my class, and nobody made a dinner out of it. When Camille passed her junior year after failing 2 classes the year before, my mother cried happy tears and my father took us all out for steak. I sat at that table and told myself that this was how love worked. Different people needed different kinds of encouragement. I convinced myself I was fine with less attention because I was older. I told myself I was mature. I was not mature. I was just already learning to disappear. After school, I went into healthcare administration. I handled billing and operations for a mid-size outpatient clinic in our city. The work suited me. It was detailed, it required pattern recognition, and it paid well enough that by the time I was 26, I had my own apartment and was building a real savings account for the first time in my life. I was proud of that. I was quietly, seriously proud of what I had made for myself on my own. Camille, meanwhile, had moved back home at 22 after a bad breakup and a job that did not last. I am not saying that to judge her. Things fall apart. I have had my own hard months. But what I am saying is that when Camille moved back in with my parents, the family center of gravity shifted in a way that I felt from across town. My mother called me more often, but the calls were about Camille. How Camille was adjusting. How Camille needed time. Whether I thought Camille should start therapy or take a trip or try a new job field, I was the sounding board. I was the advice giver. I was the resource. And I kept showing up as that person because I loved my family and I was good at helping, and it never occurred to me to wonder what I was getting in return. The engagement announcement came on a Tuesday evening. Camille called me before she called anyone else, and for one moment I felt something warm move through my chest. She called me first. Then she told me the whole story of the proposal, which had happened at a rooftop restaurant the night before, and she cried. And I cried with her because her happiness was real, and her joy was contagious, and I was genuinely glad for her. Marcus, her fiancé, was a solid man. I had met him 4 or 5 times. He was even-tempered, attentive, made good money working in commercial real estate. His family was from the northern part of the state, old family connections. a name that carried some weight in certain circles. The kind of family that dressed well at every event and never needed to say they had money because the way they held themselves already said it. Within 2 days of the announcement, my mother had decided that the engagement party needed to happen within 6 weeks. Within 3 days, she had started calling venues. Within 5 days, she had called me to talk about budget. I want to be careful here because the conversation about budget was presented as a conversation. It had the shape of a conversation, but it was not actually a conversation. It was an information delivery. My mother explained what she had envisioned for the party, how many people she wanted to invite, what the venue deposit would cost, what the catering package she had her eye on would run. Then she paused, and in that pause was the expectation that I would say yes and how much and when. I said I could contribute up to $3,000. My mother's pause after that was a different kind. The kind that communicates disappointment without using the word. She said she was thinking the family would split the larger costs, and that my father's hours had been reduced lately, and that Camille was still getting back on her feet, and that the party really needed to reflect well on the whole family, especially with Marcus's family coming down. She said it all in the kindest possible voice. She said it all as if she was simply explaining facts. She never once said the words, "We need you to pay for most of this." But by the end of the call, that was what had happened. I had agreed to cover $4,500 of the cost in exchange for being listed in the party program as a sponsor alongside 2 of my mother's church friends who had donated $200 each. I want you to sit with that for just a moment. A sponsor, in my own sister's engagement party, for $4,500. I told myself it was family. I told myself money was not the point. I told myself I was glad I was in a position to help, and that the people I loved would remember this. I was very good at telling myself things that let me keep going without asking harder questions. The 6 weeks between the announcement and the party were full. My mother pulled me into every planning detail, which I understood as involvement. She wanted my opinion on centerpieces and my help comparing catering menus and my input on the invitation design. I gave all of it willingly. I spent evenings on my laptop comparing vendors. I called the venue twice to clarify the parking situation. I arranged for a friend of mine, who did event florals on the side, to give the family a discounted rate on the table arrangements. What I did not notice until much later was that none of these contributions were being named. My mother talked to Camille about the centerpieces as if they had chosen them together. My mother told Marcus's mother, when she called to discuss the event, that the family had worked so hard to put everything together. I was in the room for that phone call. I was not mentioned by name once. Camille did call me 3 days before the party. She called to tell me that she had hired a day-of coordinator, a woman named Priya, who would be at the venue all evening handling logistics. She said this in a cheerful voice. She said it like good news. She said Priya was great, very organized, and that she wanted me to just enjoy the night and not worry about a thing. I felt a small lift in my chest at that. Finally, I was going to just be a guest, a sister, a person at her own table. Then, the morning of the party, my mother called and said Priya had a family situation come up and could not make it, and could I step in? Not as a guest, as the coordinator. I should have said no. I should have said I was sorry about Priya and that it was unfortunate timing, but that I was attending as family and not as staff, and could they please find another solution? I know that now. I knew it then, too, in the quiet, honest part of myself that I had spent years learning to talk over. But I said yes. I said yes because my mother's voice carried that particular strain in it. That meant she was close to being overwhelmed. And I had been trained since childhood to smooth that strain before it became a problem. So I drove to the venue 2 hours before the party started. I helped arrange the seating cards. I confirmed the sound system. I checked the caterer's timeline. I handled a last-minute issue with one of the hot plates. I greeted the first arriving guests and directed them to the cocktail area. I was everywhere and nobody noticed because nobody was supposed to notice. That is what coordinators are for. They make things run without being seen. By the time the formal dinner portion of the evening started, I had not sat down once. I was still moving, still solving small problems, still answering questions from the catering staff who had decided I was the point P. Arson for the evening. My chair at the family table sat empty for the first hour. Then someone's aunt who had not been assigned a seat ended up in it, and by the time I noticed, the speeches had already started and there was nowhere for me to go without making a disruption. I stood near the kitchen door. I stood there and I watched my sister shine. I watched my parents beam. I watched Marcus's family fill the room with elegance and warmth. I watched 200 guests eat the food I had helped arrange and sit at tables, decorated with flowers I had negotiated a discount for, and move through an evening that I had helped save from a coordinator crisis that morning. And I stood by the kitchen door with an empty glass in my hand, because I had picked it up somewhere along the way and forgotten to put it down. That is where the groom's father found me. His name was Gerald Whitmore. He was a man in his early 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore a blazer even on casual occasions, and who had the quiet authority of someone accustomed to a certain kind of room. I had met him once briefly at a family dinner 2 months earlier. He had shaken my hand and asked me what I did and genuinely listened to the answer, which at the time had struck me as unusual, because in my family, people did not usually listen to the answers to questions they asked me. He walked toward me with 2 glasses of sparkling water, and he held one out and he said, quite simply, "You look like you have not stopped moving since before the lights came on." I laughed a little. I said something about how there had been a lot to manage. He said, "You are Camille's older sister, Lousia." I said yes. He said he remembered from the dinner. He said Marcus had mentioned me several times, actually. He said Marcus had told him that I was the one who had really come through for the family in putting this together, that I had covered a significant part of the cost and handled most of the planning groundwork. Gerald said it plainly, not as a compliment exactly, but as a fact. The way someone states a fact they assumed everyone already knew. I did not know what to say. I was not used to having my contributions named out loud in a room where my family was present. He looked across the room toward the family table, where my mother and father were laughing with one of Marcus's uncles. He looked back at me. Then he said something that I have thought about almost every day since. He said, "I noticed tonight that there was no introduction of the bride's sister in any of the speeches. I noticed your seat was taken. And I noticed that you have been working this floor like you are on staff. And I want to tell you, because I think someone should, that none of that is invisible to me, even if it has been invisible to everyone else." I think I looked at the floor for a moment. I think my throat did something complicated. I said thank you in the quietest possible voice. He said, "You do not have to thank me for seeing what is obvious." He said he was going to go back to the table and that he hoped I would find a moment to sit down before the evening was over. And then he walked away. I stood by that kitchen door for another few minutes. I was not crying, but I was close to it, and I was close to it not because I was sad, exactly. I was close to it because someone had named the truth out loud, and it had landed somewhere in my chest that I had kept sealed for a very long time. That night on the drive home, I did not play music. I drove in silence for 40 minutes, and I let myself think about things I had been not thinking for years. I thought about the $3,000 I had contributed, and then the $4,500 I had contributed, and then I thought about the floral discount and the vendor comparisons, and the evening I spent fixing a seating chart issue, and the morning I had spent coordinating last-minute changes. I thought about how none of that had been acknowledged in a single speech, not even a passing mention. Not even one of those jokes that families make at dinner parties about the person who always shows up. Nothing. I thought about the seat taken at the family table. I thought about the apron I had borrowed from one of the catering staff because I kept picking up empty glasses. I thought about the moment during the 3rd toast when I had watched Camille look out at the room full of people who loved her, and how that gaze had passed over me completely because I was not at a table where gazes go. I was by the door. I thought about Gerald Whitmore saying, "None of that is invisible to me, even if it has been invisible to everyone else." And I thought about the fact that I had agreed to all of it, every single part. I had agreed to coordinate. I had agreed to pay. I had agreed to stay quiet when the speeches went on without my name. I had agreed to stand by the door. I had not been forced into any of it. I had chosen it, one yes at a time, because that was what love looked like in my family. Love looked like sacrifice without receipt. I decided that night that I was not going to do it anymore. I want to be careful here about what I mean by that, because I did not make a dramatic decision. I did not decide to cut my family off. I did not decide to make a scene or demand an apology or expose anyone publicly. What I decided was something quieter and, in the long run, much more powerful. I decided that I was going to stop volunteering. I was going to stop filling silences with my labor. I was going to stop being the one who smoothed everything over before anyone noticed it was rough. I was going to let things be imperfect and see who noticed and what happened. It sounds simple. It was one of the hardest decisions I have ever made. 2 days after the party, Camille called to say thank you. The call was warm and genuine, and she said the party had been beautiful and that she knew how much I had done to help make it happen. I waited to see if she would say anything about the seat, about the speeches, about the apron. She did not, but she did say one thing that caught my attention. She said, "Mom and I have been talking about the wedding, and obviously we would love for you to be involved as heavily as you were with the engagement party." As heavily as I was with the engagement party. I understood what that phrase meant. It meant, we want you to pay and coordinate and manage and show up and disappear gracefully into the background again. I said I was glad the party had gone well. I said I needed some time to figure out my schedule for the coming months. I said I would be in touch. Camille paused. She said, "Okay, of course, take your time." She said it lightly. She was not worried. She expected me to come around. She always had before. The next 3 weeks were strange. I kept waiting for the tight feeling in my chest that usually came when I was not actively helping my family with something. That feeling had been part of me for so long that I had learned to mistake it for love. When it did not come the way I expected, I felt something else instead. Not peace exactly. More like the feeling of unclenching a fist you have been making for so long you had forgotten it was closed. My mother called once a week, as she always did. The calls were friendly. She talked about the weather. She talked about a new restaurant she and my father had tried. She talked about how Camille and Marcus were looking at wedding venues. She did not ask me for anything specific. Not yet. But I could feel the architecture of a future ask in every conversation. She was laying groundwork. The ask came in the 5th week after the party, when my mother called and said she had wonderful news. Camille and Marcus had found the perfect venue, a converted estate about 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with stone walls and garden lighting, and a ballroom that held 300 guests. My mother said the price was significant, but the family was committed to making it beautiful. She said Camille deserved her dream wedding. Then she asked if I had given any thought to what kind of contribution I was planning to make. I had thought about this conversation many times in the previous 5 weeks. I had rehearsed what I would say. Not a fight, not a speech, not a long emotional explanation. Just a clear, quiet, honest answer. I said, "Mom, I love Camille and I want her wedding to be wonderful. But I am not going to be making a financial contribution to the wedding." The silence that followed was enormous. My mother said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean I am not going to be contributing financially this time. I gave a significant amount toward the engagement party, and I am not in a position to do the same for the wedding." My mother said, "Lousia, this is different. This is the wedding. This is the most important day of her life." I said, "I know it is important. I hope it is everything she wants. But my answer is the same." My mother said, "I do not understand where this is coming from. You have always been so generous." I said, "I have been generous, yes, and I am still generous. But generosity has to come from a free choice, and for a long time mine was not as free as I told myself it was. I am making a different choice now." Another silence. Then my mother said, "You know this is going to hurt her." I said, "I hope it does not. But I cannot keep doing things that hurt me to protect everyone else from discomfort." The call ended shortly after. My mother said she needed to think. She said she was not angry, but her voice said otherwise. Not furious, not explosive, just cold. The specific cold that only a mother who has learned she cannot access something she expected to have can produce. I hung up and sat in my apartment for a long time. The tight feeling did come then, finally. But it was different from guilt. It was the feeling of something that had been wound too tight for years slowly beginning to release. It was not calm. Affordable, but it was honest. My mother told Camille within the same day, as I had expected she would. Camille called that evening. The call started gently. Camille said she understood money was complicated and she was not trying to pressure me. Then she said she had hoped I would be as involved in the wedding as I had been in the engagement and that she had already started picturing it. Then she said she had spent so long thinking of me as her rock and she did not want that to change. She was not being manipulative in a calculated way. I want to be honest about that. Camille was being the person she had always been, the person who counted on my presence without ever having to ask for it twice, because it had always come automatically before. She was genuinely confused. The idea that I might say no was as foreign to her as the idea of the sky turning green. I told her what I had told my mother, in softer words. I said I loved her. I said I would be at her wedding as her sister. I said I would celebrate her. I said I just needed to step back from the financial and logistical role. Camille said, "Okay." She said it very quietly. She said she guessed she understood. She did not sound like she understood. She sounded like she was waiting for me to change my mind. I did not change my mind. The next person to call was an aunt, my mother's sister Patricia, who had always operated as the family ambassador in situations like these. Patricia called me on a Saturday morning and opened with how much she had heard I had done for the engagement party and what a beautiful event it had been and how the whole family had noticed my hard work. Which was interesting, because the whole family had not noticed anything the night of the party. Suddenly, in hindsight, my hard work had been noticed. Interesting how that works. Patricia said she was calling because she was worried. She said the wedding planning was already getting stressful and that Camille was feeling unsupported and that it would really mean a lot to everyone if I could reconsider. She said she knew I had the means. She said family stuck together. She said once the wedding was over things would go back to normal. I said, "Patricia, I appreciate the call. I understand everyone is worried, but my answer is not going to change and I would ask you to please not call me again about this." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I hope you do not regret this, Lousia." I said, "I hope so too." She hung up. I made myself a cup of tea and stood at my kitchen window and looked at the street below. A man was walking a very large dog. A child was drawing chalk marks on a section of sidewalk. The world was continuing in its normal way, completely unconcerned with whether Lousia had agreed to fund her sister's wedding. I realized that the world's normal continuation was something I had been afraid of for a long time, afraid that if I stopped holding everything up, something would collapse and it would be my fault. But out here, beyond the walls of my family's expectations, nothing was collapsing. The man walked his dog. The child drew her marks. The street stayed exactly where it was. 4 days after the call with Patricia, my father called. My father almost never called me directly. He was not a phone person. He communicated mostly through my mother or through brief appearances at family events where he would nod at me from across the room in a way that was meant to be warm. The fact that he called directly told me everything I needed to know about how hard the family was working on this. He said, "Lousia, your mother told me what happened. I want you to know I am not calling to pressure you." He then proceeded to pressure me, gently, in the way that only a father who rarely shows up can pressure you. He reminded me that Camille was his youngest. He said the wedding was a big deal for the family name, especially with Marcus's family being what they were. He said he did not want there to be a divide. He said he knew I had always been the strong one, and he was asking me to use that strength for the family. I said, "Dad, I hear you. I love you. I love Camille. My answer is the same." He said, "All right." He said it with the heaviness of a man who had expected differently. Then he said, "I hope this does not affect the relationship long term." I said, "Me too." That part I meant completely. The calls stopped for about 2 weeks after that. The silence had a different texture than the silence before. Before, the silence between me and my family had been comfortable and invisible, the silence of a person who was expected to be present and useful but did not need to be thought about. This silence was aware. Both sides were feeling it. During those 2 weeks, I had lunch with my friend Diane, who had known me for almost 10 years and who had spent more than one evening listening to me explain why my family's behavior was actually fine and that I was overthinking it. Diane had the patience of so. Mion, who had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. She let me tell the whole story from the engagement party all the way through the phone calls. She did not interrupt. When I was done, she said, "I am glad you are finally letting yourself be mad about it." I said I was not sure mad was exactly what I felt. She said, "Lousia, you stood at a party you paid for and staffed while your family sat at the table. You can call it whatever you want, but I think you are allowed to be mad." I turned that over in my head for a while. I had been so careful to frame everything in terms of decisions and patterns and choices. I had been so careful to stay calm. Diane was right that there was something else underneath all that careful framing. I was angry. Not a loud, burning anger. A deep, quiet anger. The kind that is made not from a single moment but from 100 small moments that were each easy to excuse at the time. I sat with that anger. I did not act on it. I let it be real. About 3 weeks after the family phone calls stopped, something happened that I had not expected. Gerald Whitmore called me. I had not given him my number, but Marcus had, apparently with Gerald's knowledge, because Gerald said he had asked Marcus to share it and he hoped that was all right. He said he had been thinking about the engagement party and about our conversation and that he had something he wanted to discuss if I was willing. I said I was willing. Gerald said he was calling in both a personal and a professional capacity. He explained that the Whitmore family had a small foundation, primarily focused on healthcare access in underserved communities, and that they had been looking for someone with strong healthcare administration experience to serve as an operations director on a part-time consulting basis. He said Marcus had mentioned my professional background and that after the engagement party, he had done a bit of research on his own and been impressed by what he found. He said he was not offering the role to me because of Camille. He said he was offering it because the work I had done at my clinic had apparently been significant, and he had confirmed that through a reference he had reached out to, with my employer's knowledge through a general inquiry, not in any invasive way. He said the role would be paid, substantial, and flexible around my existing work schedule. I was quiet for a moment. I asked him why he was telling me this now, after the party, after the conversation by the kitchen door. He said, "Because I saw a capable woman doing invisible work, and I thought it was time someone offered her something visible." I said I would need to think about it. He said, "Of course, take your time," and gave me his direct contact information and said the offer would remain open. I put my phone down after that call, and I sat very still. There was a sensation in my chest that I did not immediately recognize because I so rarely felt it in connection with my own life and career. I recognized it after a moment. It was the feeling of being valued. Not thanked for helping, not appreciated for showing up. Valued. For what I actually knew how to do on my own terms for my own reasons. I called Gerald back 2 days later and said I was interested in learning more. We had a 2-hour meeting over video call the following week. I asked every question I could think of. The role was real, the foundation was real, the compensation was more than I had expected, and the work aligned closely with the kind of systemic healthcare work I had wanted to move toward for the past 3 years without knowing how to get there. I said yes. Here is where I want to pause and tell you something about timing, because the timing of what happened next was the kind of thing that, if it happened in a movie, you would say was too neat to be real. But it was real, and it happened, and I watched it unfold from a position I had never been in before in my family. 2 days after I formally accepted Gerald's consulting role, my mother called me. The tone was different. Not cold. Not the careful warmth of someone laying groundwork for a request. Something that sounded closer to genuine. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said she had talked to Camille. She said she thought the family had not always been fair to me and she wanted to have a real conversation about that. I said I was glad to hear that. She said, "I know the engagement party was not everything it should have been for you. I know you did more than we acknowledged. I am sorry for that." An apology from my mother was not nothing. My mother was not a woman who apologized often or easily. I could hear what it cost her to say it. I let it land without rushing past it. I said, "Thank you, Mom, that means a lot." Then she said, "I also wanted to talk to you about the wedding, because we are getting closer and we are really struggling with some of the larger costs." And there it was. Not right away, without the apology first. But there it was, the ask, attached to the sincere feeling like a trailer being pulled by a truck. The apology was real, and the ask was also real. Both things were true at once, and I had to decide which one to respond to. I said, "Mom, the apology means something to me. I am glad we can talk about that. But my answer about the wedding is not going to change, and I do not want the apology to be connected to the ask, because that would make both of them feel less real." My mother was quiet. Then she said, "I understand." I was not sure she did, but she said it, and I held on to that. Camille called the next morning. She said she had heard I had taken on a consulting role with Marcus's family's foundation. Her voice was not angry. It was something more complicated than anger. It was the voice of someone trying to process information that did not fit the shape of the world as they understood it. She said, "You are working with the Whitmores." I said yes. I said Gerald had approached me based on my professional background. She said, "When did this happen?" I told her the timeline. The call after the party, the meeting, the offer, my acceptance. There was a pause. Then she said, "Lousia, that is a little strange, is it not? That Gerald called you after the party." I said, "I think he saw a situation clearly and responded to it." She said, "But you are going to be professionally connected to my future in-laws." I said, "Yes." She said, "Does it not worry you that this might get complicated?" I said, "Camille, I am going to be doing important work that I care about, for a foundation that does meaningful things, with people who value what I bring. Does it complicate things? Maybe, but it is my career and my decision." She said she was not trying to take that away from me. She said it quietly. She said she just wanted to understand. I said, "I know, but I think part of what you are really asking is whether I am still going to be the Lousia you have always counted on in a specific way. And the honest answer is, not in the same way, no." She was quiet for a long moment after that. Then she said something I had not expected. She said, "That is fair." She said it softly, like she was hearing herself say it and deciding it was true as she said it. She said, "I think I took you for granted, and I do not know exactly when it started, but I know that it did." I said, "I know you did not mean to." She said, "That does not make it better, does it?" I said, "No, but it makes it easier to talk about." We talked for another hour. It was the most honest conversation, Camille, and I had ever had, which is a strange thing to say about your own sister after 31 years. But it was true. We had always been close in the way that people who share a history are close, but we had never been honest in the way that people who know each other are honest. This was something different. She told me she had been scared, for years, that I would stop showing up if she did not make herself necessary to me. That the way she had talked about needing my help, relying on my strength, calling me her rock, was partly a way of making sure I stayed. That if she needed me, I would not leave. I sat with that for a long time after we got off the phone. I had spent years thinking of myself as the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who was there. And I had framed Camille as the one who took. But what Camille was describing was something that looked different from a different angle. She had been afraid of losing me, and her way of managing that fear had been to make herself need me. That was not healthy or fair, but it was human. I did not suddenly understand everything or forgive everything at once, but I understood more than I had. The wedding planning continued without my involvement or my money. I was invited to be a bridesmaid, which I accepted, on the condition that I was not also going to be a wedding coordinator. Camille laughed when I said that, a real laugh, and said she had already hired a very organized woman named Francie, who she was paying properly this time. My mother and I had 2 more difficult phone calls over the next month, calls in which she said more real things than she had said to me in years, and in which I said more honest things to her than I had allowed myself to say in years. They were not easy calls, but they were real ones, the kind that move something instead of just passing over the surface. My Aunt Patricia sent me a card in the mail, of all things, a paper card. In the card, she had written that she had reflected on their phone call and that she owed me an apology for the way she had spoken to me and for her role in the pressure I had been put under. It was 3 sentences. It was enough. Gerald and I began working together formally 6 weeks after the engagement party. The work was everything I had hoped. I was building systems, training staff, evaluating resource gaps, doing the kind of careful and meaningful work T. I had spent years learning how to do. The Whitmore Foundation was small but well-resourced, and Gerald ran it with the same quiet authority he brought to every room he entered. He was not easy to work for. He expected precision and follow-through. I was good at both. At our 3rd working meeting, he said, "You are exactly what this foundation needed." He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, just as a fact. It landed like the truest thing anyone had said about my professional life in years. Marcus, for his part, was visibly relieved that Camille and I were on steadier ground. He had known about the engagement party situation. Not all of it, but enough. He had told Gerald. He had hoped Gerald's call would land the way it did. He told me this later, at a quiet moment during a family dinner, and he said, "I hope it does not feel like an intervention, because it was not meant that way." I said it felt like someone finally opening a window in a room that had been sealed too long. The wedding happened on a warm Saturday in late September. The estate venue was extraordinary, exactly as beautiful as my mother had imagined. The garden was lit with soft amber lights. The ballroom was full. 300 guests moved through the evening, and the food was excellent, and the flowers were stunning, and Camille was radiant in the exact way that a woman who has waited her whole life to feel that particular joy is radiant. I stood at the front of the ceremony space with the other bridesmaids, and I held my bouquet, and I watched my sister walk toward the man she had chosen to build her life with, and I felt something in that moment that was uncomplicated and whole. I felt love for her, not the love that was also labor. Not the love that was also management and sacrifice and invisible coordination. Just love. The kind that does not require you to disappear into it. During the reception, I sat at the family table. My seat was not taken. I ate my dinner at a table with my name on the card. At one point during the speeches, Marcus's best man looked out at the family and made a warm comment about the Lousia who had helped make the engagement celebration possible, and who had brought real skills and real heart to everything she touched. It was brief. It was public. It was true. I looked down at my plate for a moment because I did not want anyone to see the particular expression that was moving across my face. It was not sadness. It was not triumph. It was relief. The simple and enormous relief of being named. My mother caught my eye from across the table. She did not say anything. She lifted her glass a little in my direction, just slightly, just enough. I lifted mine back. Later that evening, Gerald found me near the edge of the garden where I had stepped out for a few minutes of quiet. He said, "You look different from the last time I saw you at one of these." I said, "I am different." He said, "Good." We stood there for a moment looking at the lights strung through the trees, and then he went back inside, and I stayed a few more minutes in the quiet of the garden, listening to the sound of music drifting through the windows and the sound of people celebrating, and the sound of my own breathing, which was slower and steadier than it had been in a long time. I want to tell you what I know now that I did not know a year ago, because I think it might matter to someone listening to this. I know that being the dependable one in a family is not the same as being loved by that family. It can coexist with love, but it is not love itself. Love is not the absence of receipts. Love does not require you to be invisible to prove it is real. I know that the people who benefit most from your sacrifices are often the last ones to notice when you stop making them, because they have never had to notice before. The noticing is not something they are bad at. It is something they have never been asked to practice. I know that saying no, said clearly and without drama, is one of the most powerful sentences available to a person. It does not need explanation. It does not need a list of grievances or a history of wounds. Just the word, delivered honestly, and then the patience to let the silence after it do its own work. I know that the moment someone outside your usual world looks at you and names what they see, it can shift something in you that 100 conversations with the people inside your world could not move. Not because the outsider's view is always right, but because sometimes you need a pair of eyes that is not already used to looking through you. I know that you can love your family and hold a boundary at the same time. These two things do not cancel each other out. They actually, in the long run, make both of them more real. And I know this. The version of me standing by that kitchen door with someone else's empty glass in my hand, invisible at a party I had mostly funded, waiting for a table that had already been filled, that Versi. Anna of Lousia does not live here anymore. She is not gone. She is not forgotten. She taught me everything I needed to know about the cost of loving people who do not know how to return it in equal measure. But she does not run things anymore. Lousia runs things now. The one who sat at the family table with her name on the card, who stood at the front of the ceremony with flowers in her hands, who goes to work every week doing meaningful things for which she is valued and compensated and named. That Lousia is the one I choose. And it started, of all places, by the kitchen door, when a silver-haired man in a blazer walked over with 2 glasses of sparkling water and said, "I noticed." If any part of Lousia's story felt familiar, if you have ever been the one who held everything up while your name went unspoken, if you have ever paid for a room you were not allowed to sit down in, if you have ever been the rock for people who never thought to ask how the rock was doing, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Not because sharing pain is the point, but because the moment you name it out loud is usually the moment it starts losing its power over you. Tell me, have you ever had someone outside your family see you more clearly than the people inside it? What did that feel like?